Welcome to the DPM podcast, where we go beyond theory to give advice that works for leading better digital projects. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Aston, founder of the Digital Project Manager. Now, projects rarely go to plan. And when plans change, it often creates a whole lot of stress. Calls have to be made, meetings scheduled, plans updated, estimates recalculated, and usually change requests issued. But what if there was another way to manage change on your projects? And in this podcast, we're going to be lifting the lid on a different way to approach managing change with agile contracts. So keep listening to understand how to get agile contracts to work for you and understand the benefits and challenges of making this approach work. This podcast is brought to you by Clarizen, the leader in enterprise project and portfolio management. Visit clarizen.com to learn more. So today I'm joined by Tucker Sauer-Pivonka. He is the director of product management at Crema. And that means he's responsible for supervising the entire production team, particularly the product managers there, and really helping them grow and develop. And also he's in charge of kind of evolving their best practice as well. So hello, Tucker.
Hello, Ben. Nice to hear from you today.
Yeah, you too. So one of the things I just wanted to ask you actually, as we start, I know part of your role is this kind of development of the team. And I'm wondering if you can kind of share some of your insights on what you've found that's really worked in helping your team develop and evolve, maybe around, this kind of contracting that you're experimenting with or working with. But how do you kind of nurture the team and help them grow? What kind of have you found that works for you?
Yeah, I think the one thing that you have to recognize early on is that everybody learns a little bit differently. Everybody needs a little bit different types of coaching. So one of the first things I do with my team members is I sit down with them and I start to evaluate that. How do they learn? How do they like to receive feedback? How do they like to receive praise? I'm going to keep track of all of that. So that way I can tailor my approach to something that they'll respond to a little bit better. I think I spend quite a bit of time in our one-on-ones individually, going through different topics with them and different areas for growth, and really coaching them for anything that they're having issues with at the moment. Right. So they just kind of come up as they come up, and then we take it on. On top of that, we have a book study going on at Crema right now, around the book called Multipliers.
Right.
And so that's a big aspect of growth for our team. And then also, of course, conferences. So we have a conference coming up, I think, at the end of September that we'll be going to. That's all centered around product management. And so we'll be going to that as a team, not only to just for some team building, but also to learn about some new topics.
Nice. So what's the name of that conference? Do you know?
Industry, the product conference is what it's called. I think it's in Cincinnati, if I remember correctly.
Party in Cincinnati if you want to join Tucker and the team. But I just want to dig into, you mentioned, you'd with the team, you'll kind of maybe cover off different topics. I'm curious as to maybe if you can share any of the kind of topics or areas that you're helping the team get through at the moment. What are the kind of challenges that the team are facing that you're helping them overcome?
Yeah, I think it looks a little bit different again for every individual, just because we have different skill levels for different people on our team. So it does look a little bit different, but some of those things have really been around. A lot of it that we do in the group setting is around client management. Right. So my client said this, or my client is requesting that we do this thing, but we haven't really talked about that. So how should I handle this? And so I'm being generic because I can't think off the top of my head like a perfect example to give right now, but it's something like that. Client management things are typically the trickiest things to teach somebody how to do. So it's a little bit more of a discussion on, I felt weird about this. I don't know that was the right way to handle it. Was that right? Or should I handle this in a different way next time? And that's usually the direction our conversations take. Yeah,
it's so true. I think it's those soft skills around client management, and team management as well, isn't it? That there's never a single right answer to, it always depends. But I think, we can always grow and improve in those areas. And you mentioned going to a conference as a team, which I think is awesome. But I'm curious to understand a bit more about, where you go for inspiration and how you keep up to date with everything that's going on. How do you stay current and how do you get inspired?
Yeah, I stay inspired by kind of using a lot of different things, whether those are books that I read. I read a lot of articles. So really like Medium is somewhere I go quite a bit for a lot of inspiration around product management specifically, or managing teams and what that should look like or could look like. I think what I have to remind myself is that Medium is a great resource, but you sometimes need to take things with a grain of salt because anybody can post an article in there. And so that just because they can post something on the internet doesn't make them an expert. But it certainly, if you just go in with that attitude, it can at least give you some context into how to handle certain situations. So I use that quite a bit. And then those are really kind of like the main two. But then I also will just more like industry-wide type things. I really like Wired, the magazine. And so I usually read most of the articles in every issue. And that just helps me keep up to speed on different trends that are happening, kind of outside of the PM world itself, but kind of more into what's happening with technology overall. Yeah.
Awesome. What's the, in terms of technology, are you someone who kind of stays on the bleeding edge of tech? What's the latest what's the latest toy you bought?
Oh, that's a great question. I wish I had something super exciting to tell you. But I would hate to say that I'm on the bleeding edge of it because I would consider myself an early adopter, but I'm not necessarily any earlier than that, right? So I usually try to get new products when they come out if I can. I'm kind of salivating over a new iPad right now. I have an iPad Pro, which is fine, but I want the new version and I just can't justify it because mine works. I mean, that's a great thing about Apple products now is it works fine. I really don't need to replace it. So I can't really justify it. But I have been most recently, the latest version, I'm kind of showing my Apple nerd here, the latest version of iOS and iPad OS and everything that came out of WWDC was super interesting to me. So I have been thinking a lot about that, thinking about the impacts that those things will have on the industry as a whole, maybe even on some of the products that I'm creating. And so that's been the biggest one recently that I've been kind of looking at. And then on top of that, I'm a little bit of a Zelda nerd, and the latest, the Breath of the Wild sequel just got announced. And so I'm kind of geeking out over that too.
Nice. My thing that I'm looking at the moment is the DJI little rover. I don't know if it's called a rover or what it is, but they announced that kind of the little camera thing on a little tank that you build yourself. It looks awesome. That's on my shopping list as my next thing to buy.
That's really fun.
Again, it's like. It's one of those things, isn't it? You think, do I really need this? I don't really need this, but it'll be good for the children. They'll enjoy it. Cool. So I'm curious though, you mentioned, you love your iPad Pro. In terms of like your hardware or software, is there anything else that you've found recently that is making your life awesome that everyone else should know about?
I have struggled over the years on trying to find a balance of taking handwritten notes, taking typed notes, tracking tasks, all of that. I've tried to find a balance so that way, because there's a lot of information out there that says when you write something down, you comprehend it a little bit differently than if you type something. And that's intriguing to me. And so I've always been trying to find what that balance looks like. For a while, I was taking notes on my iPad using the Apple Pencil. And that got me pretty far down the road. But most recently, the thing that I've kind of shifted to is this concept of it's kind of in the middle ground. So I still use my iPad or my computer as kind of like the final repository for everything for work. But what I've been doing recently is I've been also carrying around a little notebook with me where I do take my day-to-day notes in. I do track, I put, tasks as they come up, that kind of thing, all in my physical notebook. And then at the end of the day, I will transfer those things into an app that I use called Todoist. to track all my different to-dos, as well as kind of the end state is that I put my notes into Bear and process them at the end of the day. Now that end state, I'm kind of gently getting into that right now. But that's been really the biggest shift in my workflow, and it's been really helpful. I notice that I'm comprehending kind of what I'm doing a little bit better. And then, it's allowing me to track my tasks a little bit better. So I'm not like immediately jumping into them. So even from a time management perspective, I think it's been really helpful.
Interesting. So you're using the physical notebook. I mean, that's to take notes. I mean, that's where you've gone back to analog for note taking and reminders and things like that. Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, but then it eventually gets put into a digital space, because I think for me, what ends up happening is that nothing can replace opening a notebook, clicking your pen, and just starting to write. Yeah. I think my biggest struggle with using the iPad to take notes with an Apple Pencil, and this sounds so silly, but there's time involved with opening up the right app, finding the right notebook that you want to use, making sure that your Apple Pencil is charged. Like, there's all these little things that seem really small, but really end up being barriers to just being able to write a note. And so what I noticed I was doing is I was carrying around my iPad and a million sticky notes, because in a meeting I would start writing on sticky notes if I have an issue, if I just need to start doing something. And I was like, this is not sustainable, and it's kind of silly to just carry around all these sticky notes. So that's really what caused me to move to a notebook.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I is a battle that I kind of deal with as well. What my latest approach is, I'm using Evernote, and I have one notebook which is my to-do list, and another one which I just call a scratch pad, and it's just a dumping ground. So whereas I get really anal about making my notes. I want my to-do list to look nice and to be ordered. And I was always messing it up. So I've now introduced this kind of scratch pad, which is, hey, all the raw stuff goes in there, and then it gets transferred into the, my to-do list, which is kind of, it sounds like a bit of a similar system. And then I have a tiny notepad that doesn't allow me, like, it's deliberately really, really small so that I can't write. I can write, reminders, but I can't write notes on it. It's too small. So that kind of try and force me into using my system. Otherwise, I start creating different lists in different places, and it ends up a big mess. But, to-do list. There we go. But, let's talk about the article. This was a case study, that you wrote for us, which is really interesting. And it's about, switching from waterfall style contracts to duration and price contracts. And we've talked about agile contracts before. And actually in the DPM school, we had someone ask this week, hey, give me an example of a agile contract. And I sent them the link. Alexa wrote a great post on agile contracts before. But for those who are unfamiliar with agile contracts, can you just briefly explain what is a duration and price contract, and how does it work?
Yeah, I'll explain how it works from the context of obviously how we do it here at Crema. That doesn't mean that it has to match this exact formula, but that's at least what I'm most familiar with. So what we consider a duration and price contract is really centering a project around a dedicated team. So that might look like 2 full-time developers, a half-time test engineer, a quarter or half-time designer, and then maybe a product manager. Well, yes, a product manager and maybe a strategist, both at quarter time each. And so it's really more focused around the team itself and the goals that you're trying to drive towards, rather than listing out exact deliverables and features, for example, with exact hour estimates next to it. Because what we have found, and I think why we see a lot of success with this, is that software is too complicated to try to estimate all of it up front and assume that everything is going to go exactly according to plan. It would be a great world if we could just plan and then everything just happened exactly how we intended to. But frankly, that never happens. And so we find that what these contracts allow us and our clients to do is to really shift to wherever the highest priority work is at. So that way, at the end of the duration, and even along the way throughout, iterative sprint cycles, we're delivering whatever's the highest value to the business. Because in a fixed scope contract, those could change over time. Let's say it's a 6-month contract, and then you get to the end of your contract and you deliver features that are no longer relevant to the business. So this really allows us to kind of shift wherever we need to in order to match the client's needs.
Cool. So, you've talked about the kind of projects that make sense for agile contracts and, software development, product development being a great case in point where, you want to be able to have that flexibility to pivot throughout the project. But I'm wondering if there's anything that you've come across in the course of trying to adopt these kind of contracts, any types of projects where you tried doing this, but that agile duration and price contract didn't work so well?
Yeah, I think there's a couple instances, maybe not so much for us, but maybe for others, kind of trying to evaluate what makes sense for them is you need to evaluate the type of work that you're doing. So like you said, Ben, the reason this works for us is because we're developing these products that are really hard to detail every single thing out and have some kind of calculated risk along with it. It's really hard to do that. And oftentimes ends up in going over, or either that's the supplier or us paying for it, or the client paying for it. And so you really have to evaluate what type of project you're doing. Now, if it's something that's repeatable, let's say that you create these standard websites with this many pages, with this type of layout, that kind of thing that you do over and over again, and it's a very repeatable process, you can have that calculated risk and do something that's more fixed scope. We don't do that type of work, but I think that's something I could see where more of a fixed price or fixed scope makes a little bit more sense. It's really more about kind of predictability and unpredictability and the thing that you're doing.
Yeah. And I think another kind of dialogue that is, emerging, I think, well, people have been talking about it for a while, but is the idea of value-based pricing. And this is obviously very different to value-based pricing. Value-based pricing, when you say, it's for a more predictable kind of project, but where you're able to say, hey, well, hey, Mr. Client, the value of this work that we're going to produce for you is, I don't know, 50K. And so you charge 50K for it. Now, the idea is that you spend less than 50K producing it, but you sell the value rather than selling hours. So I don't know if, I'm wondering if you can explore how that kind of value-based pricing that people are kind of excited about, how that fits with this, very straightforward, honest kind of duration and price kind of contract where, you get the hours that you pay for. How has that kind of impacted overall profitability? Have you found that actually, things are a lot simpler? So, you're able to be more profitable because it's very predictable because there's a built-in margin on everyone's hours. Mm-hmm. Or have you found that even despite that, you've encountered sticky situations where you've had to eat the cost and, a value-based pricing where you're like, hey, and, in the example of the case study that you present, hey, originally you estimated, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million. What if you'd have just charged 1 million and then you could have tried delivering it for less than 1 million?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think inherently it's two different things, right? So when we're building software and we're doing a duration and price model, part of it is that we don't necessarily know what the very end result is going to be. So because that's not predictable, it would be hard to put a price tag on it at the beginning because it's, you don't know what that end state might look like because it could change, because the client might change their mind, that kind of thing. I think value-based pricing works really well in scenarios where you can say, we're like you said, we're going to deliver you this thing. It's going to deliver this value to your business. Maybe it is maybe it's a design sprint or something like that.
Yeah.
That I think is a little bit easier to manage. But when you're building a big product, that's a little bit harder to do. When it comes to profitability on duration and price, I think that's one of the beauties of it is that it's kind of all built into the way that you do it because they have an allocation of a team, right? And then that allocation, that really is in itself like what they're getting. You're delivering. So let's say you have 2 full-time developers on it, well, you're not really like quote unquote going over hours because you're not really looking at it like that. You're looking at what allocation of that person that they're getting. And you're delivering that value sprint over sprint over sprint. And so it's not quite, you don't really have to worry about profitability because you can't really under deliver in that scenario. You can't really be under hours or over hours because it just isn't, it's not set up to track that way. They're not paying hour by hour.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So they're buying a team for a duration of time. Mm-hmm. Have you ever come up against the scenario where, at the end of the sprint or, after a few sprints, the client turns around and says, hey, you've been working on this for 3 sprints and I don't really think we've got the value. Like you made a mistake or you did something wrong. Like we all make mistakes and, particularly when we're working with development, things don't go to plan. So how do you deal with that kind of scenario when the client doesn't feel like they got value for the time?
Yeah, I'll say that doesn't really come up too frequently. And one of the reasons why is that we work really diligently to have alignment with our clients, not just on each sprint kickoff, but throughout those sprints and keep them in the loop on anything that's changing along the way. So honestly, I think one of the ways you manage that the best is a lot of really good communication and client management. So like I said earlier in this podcast, I think that's one of the reasons our product management team talks about it so much, because it's kind of what leads to being able to humbly say, hey, we thought this thing was going to take us 2 sprints. It looks like it's going to actually take us 3 or 4 because of what we found out. And here's what we found out. Here's why we think it's going to take this long. Now, we can back up and we can just, move on to something else if you want. But really lying all the facts out there for the client helps make those decisions and helps take the emotional aspect out of those decisions a little bit more.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably one way that we do it the best. And then again, through every single sprint that we have, even before we kick off, we're aligning with the client on what we're including in that sprint. We're making sure that the team feels comfortable about delivering what we're talking about in that sprint. And then at the end of it, we're demoing wherever we got. And if there's happens to be carryover or we found out something else, then we just chat through it and chat through why that is and make sure that the client clearly understands. So that way they don't come back later and be like, wait a second, this is not what we thought it was going to be.
Yeah. Cool. So I want to kind of dive into the case study a bit and talk about the timeline. And in the case study, you said you knew it was going to be at least 7 months of work. And I'm wondering how you got to that estimate if you weren't entirely sure what you're building. Like a 7-month timeline, like that's not an insignificant project or product development. So I'm wondering how you got to that initial 7-month estimate. And was that before you had done the prototyping phase, or was that afterwards?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in that particular instance, it was in most of our projects, that's after we've done some kind of prototyping and testing type of engagement. So that's usually like a shorter 6-week engagement. And in this case, it also included a technical audit of their existing system. And so how that helped inform the time frame that we thought we needed in order to deliver on the goals that they were trying to meet. So when you're trying to estimate things, it's a little bit of something that comes with experience. And as you do more and more projects, you start to get a good feel for what takes like a certain amount of time, what the complexity is. But then there's an aspect of this that includes the actual production team. So in that case, we wrapped up the prototyping and testing engagement. Then as a production team, we sat down and we said, okay, we can't really sit down here and define every single story that we'll do because that won't be helpful, again, because things will change. But can we take a look at what our goals are and what the different pieces of this pie look like and how complex each one of those, and kind of give them some like rough t-shirt sizes. And then from there, we start to come up with a recommendation on team size. So team makeup, how many developers, what allocations a test engineer would need to be, that kind of thing. And that's all based on the complexity of what we're building. And then on top of that, the duration is not so much about, again, because it's not a deliverables focused agreement, right? Yeah. So what it's focused on is those business goals. And it says, okay, we know that there is work here. And in this case, we knew there was a fair amount of work that would last at least 7 months, but we felt like within those 7 months, the team could stay really focused and be able to deliver on all of those goals. And it was more about, what are they looking for? What is their appetite for budget? Because frankly, software is never done. You're never done working on software. There's always new things that come up. Yeah. And so we knew that there was enough there that we could at least get 7 months, is what they would need at a minimum in order to build what they would need. Now we knew that they might need something beyond that, but to essentially get them what they were asking for, that's how we arrived at it. But really it was around focusing on the business goals, what the client was, but what the client budget appetite was, and then kind of coming at it from software's never done, but we think we can deliver these things in this time frame, and we'll work with you every sprint to make sure that we're working on whatever's the highest priority. Yeah,
and I'm guessing part of that assessment was, when you originally won the work, was ascertaining whether or not the client, could they only afford 7 months, or could they? I mean, with software, the reality is going to be that it was always going to go beyond 7 months. So I guess part of it is ascertaining whether or not the client has got that appetite and that budget to carry on beyond that.
Right. And I think, let's say, for example, that the client wanted only a 3-month contract. Perfect. That's totally fine. Let's do a 3-month contract. And then we'll just make sure within those 3 months, again, we're working on the highest priority work. And at the end of the 3 months, you will get the highest priority work done. Yeah. And so it's really thinking of it as you're kind of like, quote unquote, renting a team. You're going to get whatever that team can produce in those 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever the time frame is that you feel like you would like, we'll work around that. And then again, since we're just focusing on wherever the priority is, then it's just a conversation around that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you talked about first doing this prototyping and validation engagement. Was that a fixed price? Like you mentioned 6 weeks, I think. So did you just base that then on like 3 2-week sprints, and you said, okay, this is the prototyping and validation engagement, and I'm wondering how well defined those deliverables were at the end of those 6 weeks?
Yep. So technically it still falls under our duration and price model. But I would say that it is probably a little bit more fixed price in terms of, if you were to compare like that contract versus our regular, contract, right? Because they do come with certain kinds of deliverables, right? We do say in this kind of engagement, we will deliver you a high fidelity prototype. We will deliver you the sketch files. We will deliver all the user interviews and the notes and the corresponding research. So some of those things we do put in there, things that we know we're going to be delivering on, but it technically is still duration based. And if things shift within there, so let's say, for example, we get 3 weeks in and we realize that whatever we're talking about is not what users want, and so we need to go back to the drawing board, then we can do that. It's not based on like, you have to get this exact thing. It needs this many screens, that kind of thing. It's just, it's still duration and price based.
Yeah, which is good, because I think often where things fall down is even in this prototyping phase where you develop a prototype and the client's like, hey, well, do you know what? I don't think that's quite right. And that's before you've even tested it with users. They start wanting to tweak it and change it. And you're like, hey, well, we didn't really account for that. We were just trying to do a quick prototype and get some quick feedback. So yeah, it works if it's kind of duration and price based with that as well. Sure. So after the 6 weeks, you produce this prototype. You do some user testing, you get some feedback, and then you've produced this, you're saying, hey, it's about 7 months work. I'm wondering if you did kind of like bottom up or top down with that kind of $500,000 to $1 million figure. Did you kind of base that on asking the client, hey, how much money have you got, and work back from that? Or were you, because like you said, software's never done. So I'm wondering, how you kind of evaluated or calculated the client's appetite for the kind of size and scope of the product development.
Yeah. So luckily in this instance, where we ended up was that we came up with rough, like I mentioned earlier, kind of like rough t-shirt sizing of what we were trying to do. Roughly knew what the complexity looked like, kind of had an idea of a technical plan. And so since we had all of those things, we were able to kind of build out what a roadmap might look like. Now, we were very clear that this roadmap could change and would change over time, but that was kind of the way that we were able to get to the original 7 months. Now, we didn't necessarily know what their appetite was going to be when we presented that proposal. So we put together a proposal. We talked through what we've done so far. We talked through where we're going next and what that potential roadmap would look like, and then roughly what we'd be including in each thing, or what we thought would be the highest priority. Again, subject to change based on what they think. And we started with that, and then having the technical team there, having obviously myself in the room, and having our strategist there. Really helped kind of define what those 7 months would look like. We were like, okay, this section of the application is going to roughly take 1.5 months. We know that. And so we put all these things together in a roadmap, and then that's where we ended up getting to that 7-month number.
Cool.
Now, in that proposal phase, when we are presenting to them, after then, we just make sure that they know, hey, if this doesn't work for you, we can adjust this. We can go back to the drawing board. We can start having conversations with you about what you think you would need within 3 months, for example. If that's somewhere where you want to start, let's start having conversations about that. But we were close enough with the client at that point that we knew that they were feeling like kind of what they wanted in the quote unquote MVP. And so we were able to build out a roadmap to fit that. And that's how we ultimately got to the 7 months.
Nice. So I want to touch on methodology next. And you kind of describe in the case study the approach being agile stroke Scrum. So I'm curious, what do you take from the Scrum Bible, which is obviously very prescriptive, and what do you leave behind? How do you see your approach being different from the kind of the textbook Scrum approach? I'm particularly curious around like the product owner role, and whether or not that's the client or someone on your team, whether or not you have Scrum Masters. I mean, the roles that you've been talking about, you didn't mention a Scrum Master or a product owner. You talked about a product strategist. So how does your approach differ from the kind of internal team that Scrum really prescribes and builds itself around?
Yeah. I think, a common thing that you'll hear around here is that we put people over process. And so I probably stole this from somewhere, and I wish I could attribute it to somebody because I don't remember who.
Claim it as your own.
But we really practice Scrum with, I think, a lowercase s. So what I mean by that is that we make sure that there's enough flexibility in our process that people aren't restricted by it. And that if a team needs to adjust the process to work better with their client, they have the full autonomy to do so. So that's really kind of the high level approach we take with it. And then in terms of the roles and how it differs a little bit. So in an agency structure, it's a little harder to do that type of thing, where you have dedicated roles for everything. When you're an actual software company, let's say that, you're Apple, that can look a little bit different because of the way that you're funded, the way that your business runs, that kind of thing. So in an agency structure, it doesn't always work that way. So what we do is, so you mentioned the product owner role.
Yeah.
So typically who the product owner is our day-to-day client contact. they are usually considered the product owner. Right. Now, if we have a strategist on the project, sometimes they will be a kind of like a co-product owner and coaching that person, because for some of our clients, they don't know what it means to own software. They don't know what it means to build software all the time. And so the strategist will kind of be that co-owner with them and help them make decisions on the overall strategy, the overall direction of the product, really those product owner kind of responsibilities. Now, sometimes that can fall to our product managers if we are in a different type of scenario. I won't get too much into that, but basically sometimes we'll have projects where the product owner is on the client side, but they might not be able to be in day-to-day contact with us as much. Right. So the product manager might act more in that regard into some product owner kind of responsibilities, but obviously reporting those to the client. On the product manager side, we bundle the product manager and the Scrum Master into one role, which I know goes like so against the grain when you talk about like traditional by the book Scrum methodology. Yeah, we've just found that it works for us. We haven't, it hasn't broke yet. I mean, when it does break, we will adjust. But for now, it's worked just fine, and we run all the ceremonies, and most of our stand-ups are automated, but we set those automated stand-ups up. We check them every day. We make sure that we remove the blockers. Those are all things that just fall under our responsibilities. And frankly, it's kind of nice because we have all the context we need to make some of the more product management type decisions. And so I would say that those are probably like the two areas we depart the most from Scrum with a capital S. But the rest is pretty much the same. We do our sprint planning, estimating, retrospectives, product demos, all like you would expect us to do. We just bundle them all into one meeting, usually called a Wednesday kickoff. Right. But that's, for the most part, it's pretty similar.
Yeah. So with this kind of, you've talked about sometimes the client is the product owner, sometimes it's the product manager on your team. And I want to touch on managing change. And in the case study, you talked about their kind of conflicting priorities, the fact that they wanted to make this new thing, but the old thing where you had to keep the lights on became more and more broken as their kind of payment processing, I think it was, stopped working or was about to stop working. So often in this scenario, you'll have the client who's, they want both. They want to have, you need to carry on building the new thing and you have to fix this old thing as well. And, the scope's increasing. So I'm wondering how you manage those kind of conflicting priorities and how you educated the client through that to manage that backlog. Because in Scrum, we've got, a backlog of things, and it's the product owner's role to groom the backlog, to make sure things are in the backlog in the priority order that they should be. But what was one project became two projects, essentially. And I'm wondering from a kind of high level perspective, how you educated the client through that. And then practically in terms of the actual backlog, whether that was in Jira or Trello or whatever it was, how you help the client with the communication of that kind of what's going on in that backlog management. Yeah.
So I think the very first kind of thing that you need to tell yourself, or that you need to kind of think through, is that when it comes to priority shifting, you need to be really, especially in an agency environment, you really need to be empathetic to what's causing those changes in priority. Most of the time, the client doesn't want to shift priorities. They want you to stay focused because they want you to deliver what they originally were asking for. Yeah. Right? But you need to come at it from like an empathetic standpoint and understand that they would not be asking you to do this or asking you to change things if they didn't absolutely need to. And so that's kind of the first place to start, is understanding what is the cause of the change. Is this truly a high priority? Is this a squeaky wheel type of situation? Is this something that a stakeholder said that you're doing to make sure you appease those stakeholders? And to be clear, all those are very fair answers. It's just understanding where they're coming from will help inform how you communicate to them. So that's the first place to start. And then the second place is making sure that when you are communicating, that it is abundantly clear, and I mean abundantly, that by shifting things, it changes the plan entirely. So let's say that you're working on a product, you're working on this huge new feature set. You're really, the team's all behind it. You're about halfway through with it. You're making some good progress. And then this hot new feature thing comes in that they need right away because a client of theirs just signed on and that contract is worth, a bunch of money and they need this feature. So that's a very common scenario.
Yeah.
But then the product team needs to get behind that. So on our side, so after I understand that, then I go to the team and I say, hey, the reason that they're asking about this is because of this situation. And then it takes the emotion out of it a little bit more and the frustration of it, because then it helps the whole team understand why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I start. And then after we kind of all get aligned, I make sure checkpoints along the way that the client understands by doing this, the team is moving off of this other thing. When we move off of this other thing, it means that we're not going to complete this other thing by when we thought we were going to complete it, which is fine, to be perfectly clear, but it does change the plan a little bit. And so I just make sure that it's ultra clear what decision that we're making. And in this case, in the case study that I wrote, we thought we knew where the end of that work was going to be, but we didn't. Yeah. And so it took a lot of communication with the client along the way to say, hey, this is fine, but just so you know, it's really taking us away from the larger business goal that we were trying to reach. And that was okay. And that's, again, okay with us too, as long as they're aligned with what that means, because it is, it can become an expensive mistake if it's not the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And then I think on the tool front, any kind of visualizations that you can use, even within the tools, whether that's Jira or, whatever you might use, those could be really helpful to communicate what that looks like. Because sometimes a client, and I learned this lesson also on this project, or it was a good reminder at least, was that I would say some things, but sometimes it doesn't always you can say one thing, but it might not register in the same way if they see it visualized.
So do you give them access to Jira then? Do you use Jira? Are they in Jira?
Yeah. We take an approach with our clients of full transparency into everything that we do. So they have access to the tools that we're in. We have them as guests in our Slack team. But yeah, they get into Jira. They actually get into there to help make sure that we have the right priority. Do we have the right requirements here? Is this kind of the right direction we want to be going in? So we have them in there quite a bit to make sure that they're aligned with what we're doing. And like what we were talking about earlier, that helps when you get to the end of the sprint and they're like, wait a second, I thought this sprint was going to include that. And then that doesn't happen as frequently since they're seeing what you're putting into the sprint and they have access to it.
Yeah. And I think, you talk in the case study about, getting to a position of trust, and, that transparency obviously helps that. You talk about as well in your lessons learned about, the importance of delivering these artifacts. And you talk about, updating the roadmap, updating the burn down chart. But what for you, in that whole, there's so many different things that we need to communicate. How do you keep that, or prevent, I guess, the client from being totally overwhelmed? Because, if you don't have a particularly technical client and you put them into Jira and you're showing them all these different things, the backlog, you're showing them, the work in progress, that, they've got access to everything. How do you kind of maintain that position of trust and ensure that they don't feel like something was swept under the carpet because it was, it was a comment in a ticket somewhere and they didn't see it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of that answer derives from being admitting humble mistake, being humble about the mistakes that you make. So, I think that's, if you do that frequently with the client, it can build a lot of trust really quickly, because then they understand you're not BSing them. Because they're like, oh, well, they just told us that they made this really embarrassing mistake, but they told us how they're going to fix it. And so it just helps it helps build that right away. The more and more that you do that, they realize that you're the real deal, that you really are trying to build their trust, that you really do have the same interests in mind. Like their success is our success. Their referrals are our success. Like we want to do good work on both fronts. And so just being really upfront with all of that. From an overwhelming standpoint of getting into the tools, we don't require that clients get in there. We make sure that they have it if they want it. And then what we do with our clients is we'll create personalized, like screen capture videos, walking them through a tool and like, here's how you use it. Here's how you find what you're looking for. Here are some helpful tips. Here are some areas that you probably don't really need to worry about. And then we just make sure that if they are feeling overwhelmed, that we have an open door policy that they let us know so that we can remediate it rather quickly.
Yeah.
And truly, we haven't run into too many problems with that. There's been a couple of instances where there's kind of been that overwhelming feeling. And it's more so around kind of checking to make sure that all the designs are right and that kind of thing. Because, especially on these big products, you can have, 500 screens and the client can then all of a sudden get overwhelmed because like, oh my gosh, I have so many screens to review. And so one way to get around that is just making sure that one, they have access to the tool so they can go in there as needed. And two, that we try to deliver things to them very iteratively and kind of trickle them so that it doesn't all just end up in their lap at one point in time. That doesn't always work because sometimes it does pile up over time and we try to tell them that that's happening. But if we try to be upfront like that, it tends to help quite a bit.
Cool. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is in terms of the level of reporting you provide. So obviously the client's paying for a team for an amount of time. Do you provide a kind of reporting on time spent and timesheets and things like that? Or do you just say to the client, hey, you're buying the team and you just trust us that we worked on the project? How does that work?
Yeah. So really what the reporting is, to at least to the extent that you're talking about it, is making sure that we're delivering results, right? So we have metrics that we meet every sprint. So for example, at the end of a sprint, we will go through what was completed in a sprint, what maybe wasn't completed. We'll talk about what our velocity is. Maybe it went up, maybe it went down a little bit, and talk about why that might be. And so we really focus on the results that we're delivering them because that kind of speaks to our allocations. Yeah. We don't report on hours again, since it's not like, yes, they're buying a team, but we're not saying like, oh, this is the exact amount of hours it's going to take for this feature and so on and so forth. So we don't provide that level of reporting for our clients, but what we do use that reporting for is to make sure that our allocations are correct. So if we have somebody that's half-time on a project, are they spending over half-time on it? If so, we probably need to go back to the client and let them know that we need to talk about either removing some things from that person's plate or raising their allocation. Or it might be that maybe it's a slow season and maybe they're a little bit under. And so then we'll talk about taking that allocation down. But traditionally that does not happen. It's very rare for that to happen. Usually the allocations are pretty spot on. Now there might be variance from week to week or that kind of thing where maybe I'm quarter time on a project and one week I end up putting in like halftime, because there were some big things going on and I needed to handle some things and I had a trip or whatever it might be. But then the next week that balances back out. Right. So we try to keep an eye on those kinds of metrics just to make sure that our allocations are correct, but we don't report those types of things. We just report on what work has been completed, what work hasn't been. And truly, we've never really run into issues around that.
Well, look at you. That's cool. So I want to close by just asking, when and how do these kind of duration and price contracts not work? Like, has it ever kind of all spectacularly fallen apart for you ever? And the situation I'm imagining is when, and I mentioned this before, was when, sometimes clients are underwhelmed by the progress. But, how, if someone's thinking about taking this on, what should they watch out for in terms of things going awry?
Yeah, things can definitely go awry, and especially around like maybe the client is underwhelmed by the progress. And I think what I would encourage those people to do is just to make sure that when they start to get hints of that, which as long as they're communicating frequently, they should start to feel some of that. That's going to feel like there's a little bit of weirdness or like something's going unsaid. And to honestly just come from a really frank spot and be like, hey, I don't feel like we're on the same page about something. Can we talk about it? And really just, dive into the deep end and figure out what's causing them to feel overwhelmed, and try to start talking through that early. Because if you try to wait till the end, it's not going to end well, because then they won't want to renew. You won't have a chance to rebuild that trust. So when you're starting to have that little bit of feeling of weirdness, your intuition is probably correct, and you probably need to have a conversation. I think in terms of, I don't think I've ever really had anything fall apart. I did have a scenario where we were getting ready to renew, and like you said, they were underwhelmed on progress. But then I talked to them about it and understood where they were coming from. Again, coming from a point of empathy, and then said, okay, that totally makes sense. I totally get where you're coming from. Let me go back and let me take a look at some of the work that we've done so I can get to the bottom of what might be the issue here. Well, what was the issue was that, that we had moved on to some other work based on a priority change, and what they were expecting us to be done, what was expected to be done by that end of that before we moved on to a renewal, it got us off track by about 2 months, because we went 2 months and worked on this other thing, which is what they needed for their business, but that's okay. But me explaining that to them, they were like, oh, okay. Yep, I understand. We're the ones that did it. And they also I didn't point it out or anything, but they remembered after me talking to you a little bit that we talked about what the effects of those things are, what this could cause down the road. And then they understood how we work a little bit better. And then each time those conversations happen, they kind of build on top of each other, because there can be this little point of frustration. You're like, okay, that's fine. Remember that we can change this at any point in time. We can move back to these goals. But you're really in the driver's seat here. So you just let us know where we should be moving towards, and we'll make sure that it happens. And that really helps us get back on track really quickly. So, I haven't seen anything so far happen where it's just completely fell apart. Really, most of it's just around misalignment. And if the client's not willing to get aligned with you, then that's kind of all right, well, maybe we just aren't the best for each other, and that's okay. Maybe it's time to move on, and we can help you find a new partner. But that can happen sometimes, but we try to funnel that out early in our sales process so that we don't experience that further down the road. Yeah.
And I think for me, one of the big kind of learnings when hearing your story is, it takes the right client for this to work. So I don't think, and what we've been talking about takes a certain maturity from the client to be able to understand that, things take time, that if priorities change, then that affects the timeline and that affects the cost. And these are all things that often are very tricky with clients, because, they have a finite budget, they have a deadline. And, if you're pitching against another agency or, another team, then, everyone's trying to be as competitive as possible, put their best foot forward. But that often doesn't create the right conditions for managing clients' expectations about, what you can realistically deliver for a certain price or within a certain time. So a big part of this, from my understanding anyway, is that new business process and educating the clients through that, educating the clients through the prototyping and validation phase, and managing and setting their expectations about what the engagement could look like. But then the result of that is delivering value right the way through as is prioritized by the client. So at the end of the day, I think the client gets a much better output, rather than the agency taking shortcuts or making prioritization decisions that perhaps they shouldn't be, just to try and get things on budget or deliver on time. So I think the duration and price contracts is definitely an interesting concept to talk about. So thanks, Tucker, so much for joining us today.
Of course, this has been a great conversation. Thanks for having me.
So I wonder what you think. I wonder if you've tried an agile contract. I'd love to know how it went. Tell us what you think. Comment on this post and head to the digitalprojectmanager.com to join our Slack team, and you'll find all kinds of interesting conversations going on about all things project delivery. We've got an agile channel. It'd be great to discuss this in there. And if you like what you heard today, please subscribe and take a couple of minutes to leave an honest review for the DPM podcast on Apple Podcasts. Ratings and reviews are really helpful to us, and it's greatly appreciated. But until next time, thanks for listening.